Okay. Uh, Hi all. First of all, thank you so much for coming on a Saturday morning. I really appreciate your presence. Today's talk is going to be on creating flexible grids using SASS. I'll be doing a brief preview about how grids have evolved over time, and then I'll show you some code demos on how we can achieve ratio-based grids for your designs. My name is Vinay, and you can find me on the internet at the following addresses. What is a grid? It's I really like this code when I was looking for explanations of what a grid is. It's a preconceived layout that you have where you start placing your elements or placing the elements of your web application on top of it. It's used to kind of create a harmonious visual representation of your website. That would be something like this. We have columns, and then the spacing between columns is called gutters, and you can have several rows of this. And this is how we used to do achieve grids in the early beginning stages of web designing. We use table-based layouts, and we have something called a spacer GIF that is used to create spacing in between columns. And this was extremely painful, highly unmaintainable method of doing this. And if you had to make any changes to your layout, you had to go back into your markup and change everything. And it's so bad that I couldn't find an article written about how bad it is after 2011. And we've kind of moved on to float-based layouts for grids. This is what is predominantly being used, and we still have to bring about a proper spec for grids in CSS. It is in the works, but it's not production ready. And to solve this whole creating a grid for every website that you create, people came up with grid systems that would kind of abstract and provide you a library which you can just drag and drop into your project, and you could have a very neat grid system. But the problem with this was it was designed at a point when screen sizes were kind of standard, and you had like a 1024 screen would be like the biggest monitor you could purchase in the market, and there was no problem about screen resolution. Uh, I hope you can see this. So this is how they would achieve that grid system would achieve the column layouts. They would have predefined classes for each different types of layouts. If you want to split your screen into 2 columns, 3 columns, 4 columns, and they'd have classes, and you just add those classes to your markup. And this is sort of a sample representation of how that code would be. It was really advantageous to have these grid systems because at that point we didn't have a standard way to achieve this, and it was a very nice abstraction where you don't have to think about it every time you are creating a new website. And it's kind of also standard that you get you get to sort of lay out elements in a very standardized manner. You don't have to think up of a new system every time you're creating a new website. And it got over the disadvantage that table-based layouts had regarding maintainability. So now, if you had to change your layout, you just had to go into your CSS and make some changes. And of course, you were able to nest columns into each other. So if inside of every column you were able to gain that same grid layout inside of that. So you split the section into 2 columns uh, and inside of each of these columns you get the same grid layout again. You can span that 50% of the screen width into another 12 columns, which allowed you to kind of create a very nice layout. And you were able to center columns if you wanted to sort of just put some content that's centered clean. It was very easy to achieve all of this with a grid system. And the problems with that was and the problem with that was it was always standardized at 960 pixels, and it was not responsive. We suddenly had this problem where we needed things to be responsive. And it worked great for fixed screen sizes, that even if you resize your screen, it just adds a scroll bar. The layout just remains fixed and it doesn't adapt to what changes you make. But if you think about it, this is not the web anymore. These grid systems were designed for systems that were, people who were browsing the internet from their desktops. But right now we have like a huge plethora of internet-enabled devices, and we need our websites and web applications to work on each of these, which brought us into responsive grid systems. Uh, the responsive grid systems are, if you think about it, they have media query breakpoints, and you establish an entire new grid beyond that point. So you have a 12-column layout, for example, on your mobile phones. And then once it moves to a tablet, you have another grid that works within the tablet and desktop region. And then once you move to a desktop, you have uh, another set of grid for large screens. And most of these responsive grid systems are designed to be mobile first. So you design for your mobile screen, the smallest screen first. You find out what works best there, which is usually stacking things on top of each other. And the moment you have additional space, you create more columns and try to utilize that additional space by changing your layout. And another great, uh, I would say, requirement and solution that was provided by these responsive grid systems is you had to change the way your content is ordered. So if I have a sidebar and a content area on my large screen, and then when I go into a smaller screen, I want the content area to appear first. But in my HTML, I have code for my sidebar first and then the content area next. So technically, the stacking order would be your sidebar and then the content. But with these grid systems, you can reverse that and have your content show up first and then push the sidebar to a lower portion of the screen. So that's called source ordering, and these responsive grid systems allow you to do that. Uh, there's sort of a problem that's kind of going on, that these responsive grid systems might be getting a little out of hand. So right now, Bootstrap ships with five different grids for extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large screens. Foundation ships with three different grids, and as time passes, we realize that there are more screens that we need to support, and we are having refrigerators and televisions that are internet enabled, and we want the application to at least look, if not look good, at least be usable on these screens. And what solution these responsive grids provide you are symmetric 12-column grids at every breakpoint. If you really think about it, you might not be using 12 columns everywhere, and it's kind of too generic. This is how we are designing grids, designing using grids that are available today, right? It's a pain. And if you look at the code that's being used to achieve this grid layout, for example, this is from the foundation layout. To achieve something really simple, we are having to write a lot of code. And these are called presentational classes that are in your markup. When what you really want is to be more definitive about your content. So if you are the person that designed using this code, and you go back and you know what it exactly does, if there's someone else that's going in, they have no idea what this code does. So they don't know they just know how it's being laid out. So instead, we should really try to use semantic classes uh, for your markup, and then sort of build your grid inside of these classes. So with the current grids, the problems we have is it's not readable, as you saw. It's not semantic. You have no idea what it does. This was an April Fool's joke by one of the publications, but it kind of gives you an idea as to where we are headed. So if you wanted more backward compatibility, or if you had more devices to support, it just means you're adding more classes into your markup. And these are presentational classes and need not necessarily be the way we have to achieve this grid layout. And The other problem we have is, supposing this is not so much of a hypothetical situation that there's a new device in the market tomorrow that we just have to support because it's super popular, and it could completely have a different resolution or a screen size that we are not supporting right now. So if you had to support that in an existing application with a grid from Bootstrap or Foundation or any of these generic grid systems, you would have to create an entire new grid system for that layout, and then kind of backtrack into your markup and add additional classes into your markup to support this new layout. It seems like a lot of work, and it really shouldn't be this way. You should be able to achieve it by just using your CSS. So again, it's not scalable, right? Designing with current systems, if you have new devices in the market, you have a lot of work to do to ensure that you're supporting. And the same way, it's not so much maintainable either. It can easily get out of hand. Most of the times, we don't even have a look at what the grid CSS looks like. It's just a huge bunch of code that people just use when they're creating the application in the initial stages, and then we don't go back and revise it in any way. This is a quote from one of those products that are professing that we should be giving out more flexible grids. It's from a product called GridSet app. It's a paid product, and they believe that we shouldn't be abstracting our layout into one size fits all. All of these grid systems are very generic, and it works in most cases. It need not necessarily work for you, and we shouldn't be trying to reverse engineer our requirements into these grids. Uh, that's that's a huge problem. There are some layouts that look aesthetically very nice, but we just cannot achieve them using these traditional grids that we're using. So a lot of places I see that we toss out a design idea simply because our grid system does not support it. And that's a very wrong way to go about, and it's a huge constraint to designers who are trying to design in the browser. This is an example of how Foundation gives you a 12 column grid, and then you have a header and main content and sidebar. If you really think about it, if this was all you were building in your application, it doesn't have to be 12 columns. It's just a 2 column layout with the second row is a ratio where the content area is twice as large as the sidebar. And we don't really have to use like an entire, especially when you're building single page applications, you don't have to ship in like responsive grids that are hardly being used. So if you looked at that previous example, it's not really a 12 column layout, it's just a 2 column layout. And this I found out to be really funny, that you cannot create, at least you cannot be straightforward with your code and create a 5 column or 7 column grid using Bootstrap that takes up the entire screen space. Because they are using a standard number as 12, it either has to be even numbers like 2, 4, 3 works, because 12 is divisible by 3. But if you want to do a 5 column layout that takes up the entire screen space, or a 7 column layout that takes up the entire screen space, it's still achievable, but it's not straightforward. So it's like I said, it's tricky to build an odd number of columns that utilize the entire screen space. So that's a huge constraint as a front-end developer or a designer, that some things just don't work and you just cannot think in those terms. So to add on to the list of problems that we have with current grid systems, it's too generic. 12 columns works in most cases, and it need not work in your case if your design is unique or your requirement is unique. And it's a huge constraint to designers that certain designs have to be tossed out because it's not implementable. This is Bootstrap, and this is how many lines of code they have currently in there. CSS is 100 kilobytes, and like at least 20% of that is just the grid. So they have like Foundation, again, it has like 150 kilobytes of CSS. Again, a major portion of that is the grid. And what's funny is if you actually verify, there's at least 91% of grid classes are not being used on most of the screens. So the question is, they provide a 12 column layout for a small screen, but I've hardly found any use across different applications that I've come to see that nobody can split this small screen into 12 columns and make it meaningful. Maybe a very small portion, but if you think about it, they're kind of shipping all of that code unnecessarily. And again, that brings us to the question that do you really use 12 columns on any layout, on any screen or any device? Or is it kind of, can you get out of the thinking that, okay, my layout is 12 columns, and can you think more in terms of ratios and proportions? Uh, and I find this really annoying that we are shipping a huge percentage of code that we are not using in our application. It's just sitting there, and everyone that accesses our website is getting this has to download all of this data unnecessarily, and I find that really sad. So to add on to the list, we have code bloat as well, right? So those are the whole bunch of problems that I find with current standard 12 column grids. And luckily, we have like a huge bunch of solutions to solve this problem. Uh, all of these are SASS based plugins that you can create designs out of. There's SUSI, there's Singularity, which I'll show you a nice code demo of, and G framework is there. Zen is kind of very simple to get started with. Flint is like super new, and GridSet app is a completely different approach. It's a visual product and it's a paid product, but it kind of helps you achieve beautiful designs using ratios and create and kind of convert that into meaningful CSS. Uh, Before we go into a deep dive into Singularity, I'd like to show you uh, some of the layers that we have to kind of explain what we're trying to achieve, right? So these layouts are inspired from print, and these are designs that people have achieved like in 1965 or 19, very early, and they were able to achieve very beautiful layouts for single pages that create a lot of harmony and have a lot of aesthetic appeal and are not divided into 12 columns, right? These examples are taken again from the GridSet app website, which you can check out. This is a 5 column layout, and you can see how they've overlaid the grid on top of it. You can see how we have different widths. It's just 5 columns for this page. And if you actually hide the grid, you can see the beauty of this layout, right? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, you can see how aesthetic it looks. These have been used in print for quite a long time, and it's time that we take, since everything on the web is actually inspired by print, we should be trying to achieve these layouts as well. This is one of the layouts. This is another layout that uses the golden ratio. And again, if I hide the grid, you kind of see that there's meaning between the spacing. These numbers are not arbitrary numbers. They have a ratio or a relation in between all of them. And it applies to your widths, it applies to your spacing in between each of the columns. And it's very refreshing to have these kind of designs take over the internet. Okay, this is another example of a similar grid, and you have a lot of possibilities to lay out. It's the same concept. You have the same flexibility that you build a grid and then you kind of lay out elements on top of it, but there's more design aesthetics involved, and it need not be something that you just drag and drop from a standard library into your application. So there's that. Coming back to what I was showing, these are some people who have been phenomenal in this area. where they've tried to sort of bridge the gap between design and code, and they're pushing the whole concept of designing in the browser forward, and you can like follow these people to get some really cool updates on what is possible. And Scott Kellum is the guy that invented Singularity Grid System. Uh, the other solutions in the future that we have, uh, the future is bright. That CSS spec is taking this into account. That there is actually no specific layout module itself, and they are working on a grid module for CSS. And we also have Flexbox that kind of solves a lot of problems that we currently face. Uh, like Linus once said, talk is cheap, and it's kind of really easy to say this is how things should be. But what's really cool is to be able to perform all of that in code. So I'll kind of just run you through the most basic activities that you can do using Singularity, and you can kind of take that forward and play and create your own ratio-based grids. So for the Singularity demonstration, I use an app called SASS, which is really cool for any SaaS-based demonstrations that you have. Uh, it's a cool app that you can basically see the CSS that's compiled, and you can also see the output as to how it's going to look. And the first and foremost thing that we need to do is add a bunch of Ruby gems. And the good part about using the SaaSmeister app is you don't have to install it on your system or anything just to play with it. So you can just add there's a whole bunch of SaaS-based gems that you can use for experimenting basically. And then if you really like it, you can choose to just copy the CSS, or you can choose to install those Ruby gems into your system. So another thing that I'd like to mention is we use something called breakpoint for writing media queries easily. It's really simple to sort of write media queries using breakpoint. Uh, so you just say @include breakpoint and give it a width. It would convert that into a min width media query in CSS. So that is the major feature that I'll be using today, and you can sort of explore more about it at this link. Again, this is also from Team SASS that are building really cool stuff for SASS. So let me just show you how I'm going to add. So I'll be adding breakpoint because that's a dependency, and I'll be adding Singularity GS, which is Singularity Grid System. And for a couple of advanced features, they also have something called Singularity Extras, which I'll show you in a bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is sort of create 3 divs, and I'm going to call them like sidebar primary, sidebar secondary, content area. So so that's my markup, and just so you can visualize how this looks, I'm going to apply a background to these. Right, so currently it's giving me those 3 grids, I'm sorry, 3 div blocks stacked on top of each other without any margins. So with Singularity, the first thing you would do is include add grid 1 1 1. Right, so what I'm telling is I have my screen and I'm splitting it into 3 columns, and each of these columns are of the same width. So it would take the 100% and split it into 3 columns of equal widths. And if you notice, nothing really changed in the output because we haven't applied this grid to those particular classes. That's kind of a huge realization that I had when I got started with this. Is with Bootstrap, if you just do span 4, it would automatically do all of this for you. But with Singularity, there is a little bit of extra step, but there's a lot of advantages to doing this. So right now I have a grid that spans 3 equal columns for the entire screen, and now I have to apply that to each of these divs. So I'm going to say add include grid span, and this is, I say 1 comma 1, it means it spans one column and it starts at the first position. So this is something called an isolation span, in which it is required that you mention which position this column starts at. So if I expand that and continue the same way, so my second column spans one column, but it starts at the second position. And that's sidebar, secondary. And then we have content area. Right. So if you see, I have now achieved what I initially set out to do, that I'm spanning 3 columns, and each of them have equal widths. And by defining the position, we have one great advantage is that the whole source ordering that I told you about becomes really easy. So if you look at this sidebar primary, content, and secondary. Okay, so although this is how it is laid out, what I really want is my content in the middle. So that kind of changing becomes really easy. I just say the secondary sidebar starts at the third position, and the content area starts at the second position. And with that, it's super easy to swap where each of these columns are laid out without having to go into your markup and do any pushing or pulling. And this need not be a static, something that you do at one screen size. So you can actually do this at different screen sizes. So let's go add in some breakpoints. So okay, let's go add in some breakpoints where I change the behavior beyond a certain screen size. So this is my default layout right now, but let's say beyond 700 pixels, I change the way it works. Like I can also kind of add colors to these backgrounds so it's easier to understand. Sidebar primary is going to be blue in color. Okay. Secondary background is green. And content is yellow. Okay, so now it's easier to kind of identify when things change. So I'm saying beyond, this is a very simple syntax. We use the breakpoint plugin. I said beyond 700 pixels, change the default behavior and put the primary sidebar to the far right. So it does that. And again, I have to do the same thing over here. I say add include breakpoint of 700 pixels. And beyond that 700 pixels, include web span and move this to the first position. So when I resize my screen, you'll be able to see, right? This sidebar primary is to the left and secondary is to the far right. And then once I expand my screen, sidebar primary comes to the right hand side and secondary goes to the far left. So it's very simple to achieve that swapping of layouts in between breakpoints. So that's one thing. The other thing is I don't really want my sidebar and my content area to be the same widths. So I'm going to change this to 4, right? And with that, you can easily change your entire grid layout, saying these columns are in a proportion of 1:4:1. So right now I have my primary and secondary sidebar taking up very less space, and you can see how easy it is to change it. It's just a change in that proportion. So if you have a different behavior in the future, you can do that. And it's not just how you're spanning these grids that changes between the breakpoints. You can actually change the entire grid at breakpoints. So I can actually add another grid, 111, at 700 pixels. And then we have to define behavior for this. So like I said, when you add grid, nothing really changes in the output, and you have to define that behavior. So since we already have a behavior defined for 700 pixels, I'll add a separate grid at 900. So I'm saying at 900, I will change the grid to kind of be laid out in a different manner, and then I have to go into each of these columns and define a different behavior, right? So add include breakpoint 900 pixels. Okay, add include grid span of 0.1. And then we have to repeat this for all of these uh, classes that we have. So I have basically created a new grid beyond a breakpoint that changes the way my columns are laid out after 900 pixels. And if we resize the screen and we see this behavior is retained on smaller screens that we defined earlier, and the moment we have more space, it changes the way it's. So you can change the way things are positioned, and you can change the way things take up space. But like earlier, I had mentioned that ratio-based grids are really cool to sort of create more aesthetic layouts. So it's not just whole numbers that you need to provide here. You can also provide ratios. So you can do 1:1.618, and you can basically add any relational number, right? So generate some numbers for your uh, for your choose a ratio, right? We have something called modulascale.com that allows you to choose different scales, like perfect, fifth, golden ratio, minor second. So these are all ratios that have meaningful numbers. And then if you provide it with a particular, so let's say I'm doing a golden ratio based design, and I provide it like my ideal text size is 16 pixels, and the width of maximum width is say 960, and I submit. It just gives me a bunch of numbers that make sense, which I can then use inside of my layout. So this is the base layout, and this is my important number over here. So I can have sections that kind of use this ratio inside of them. So I can define widths, can define grids using that, using those numbers. So 960, 751, and let's say 464. So that kind of uses, so you can already kind of feel how those numbers are related, how these uh, columns kind of stack up against each other. So you can use these ratio-based numbers to create ratio-based grids for your designs that are more aesthetic and meaningful. So we have that. So there's also this feature that you don't have to have a fixed gutter. So with Bootstrap, you have like you can choose what size it is, but it's usually fixed. But you can also add a different gutter at in between different breakpoints. So that kind of spacing between your columns. Mm, include. Let's add a default gutter first. Yeah. So so I've added a default gutter that's like 1/3, but it need not necessarily be 1/3. It can be 1/6. It can be 1/10. So you have the ability to add fractions for your gutter spacing. If you see the spacing in between the columns, right? 1/50th would be like super small gap in between the columns, and 1/5 would add a lot of gap. So it adds a lot of flexibility, and you can also do the same thing in between different breakpoints. So I think adding one would like add. Okay, I'm not sure how that works, but you get the idea that you can add different grid definitions in between breakpoints. So that's a kind of flexibility that it allows. And again, to kind of backtrack and tell you how this solves one of the major problems that we have right now is tomorrow if there's a new device, there is literally nothing that I have to go and change in my markup. And it's just a matter of saying add include add grid for your new resolution or new screen width, and then go into each of these and define your behaviors in that new layout. So so that's pretty much all I have to show you guys. There's also this idea that it doesn't really work this way in your application. So if you are a designer, it works that you have the patience to kind of play with all of these ratios. But if you have some developers who need to kind of get things out quickly, you need to be able to provide them with what Bootstrap provides, right? Standard classes that divide the screen into different widths. So they have something called a float span, uh, which allows you to achieve that uh, sort of fixed width. You have, let's say, you have some sort of repeating visual feature, let's say an article or something that keeps repeating, and you want to align two or three articles next to each other. So you would probably use the float span. Whatever we've seen right now is the isolation span, where you tell what where this column begins and how much width it takes. And also another thing that I failed to show you guys is uh, it need not necessarily span one column, right? I can also say that it spans two columns. So it kind of takes up more space and bumps into the other. So it's a lot of cool stuff to play around with, and it kind of also brings in a meaning to a grid system that is super cool. Uh, yep. So the five column layout that I mentioned earlier, right? That was difficult to achieve with Bootstrap. So I already have a pre-built demo for that. So with SASS Meister, you can like export all of this code into a gist and store it. And I think you can also edit it if you put that. Mm, how do I edit a gist? Let's say I save this gist. Yeah, okay. Save this. Right. So and then I can import that gist back into SASS Meister and start playing around with it. So this is how you achieve like a five column layout that takes up the entire screen space. And I basically say add a grid that has five columns, add gutter that's 30 pixels, and then I've defined five different uh, divs in my markup. And I go into each one of them and I say start at the first position and span one column, start at the second position. So it's kind of really simple to achieve things that are difficult right now, and sort of it opens up a lot of new design possibilities for your grids. So I think with that I complete my presentation, and we are open for questions. If you guys have any questions, then feel free to ask.